I now give the floor to Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo.
Thank you. Madam President, since I last briefed this Council on 17 March, the security situation in Ukraine has seriously deteriorated. The number of Ukrainian civilians killed has more than doubled. Ukrainian cities continue to be mercilessly pounded, often indiscriminately, by heavy artillery and aerial bombardments. And hundreds of thousands of people, including children, the elderly, and the disabled, remain trapped in encircled areas under nightmarish conditions. The devastation wrought on Mariupol and other Ukrainian cities is one of the shameful hallmarks of this senseless war. The horror deepened this past weekend as shocking images emerged of dead civilians, some with hands bound, lying in the streets of Bucha, the town near Kiev formerly held by Russian forces. Many bodies were also found in a mass grave in the same locality. Reports by non-governmental organizations and media also allege summary executions of civilians, rape and looting in Chernihiv, Kharkiv, and Kiev regions. Madam President, away from the fighting, diplomatic efforts to end this war, including direct talks between Ukrainian and Russian representatives, have continued. We commend the government of Turkey for hosting these discussions, as well as the efforts of many others engaging with Russia and Ukraine to help bring about peace. We welcome the willingness of the sides to continue engaging to reach a mutual understanding. This requires good faith and earnest efforts, and progress in the negotiations should be translated quickly into action on the ground. While there has been a reported reduction of Russian troops in attacks around Kiev and Chernihiv, such moves should not be merely tactical, repositioning forces for renewed attacks on Ukrainian cities and towns elsewhere. The General Assembly has twice called for Russian forces to withdraw entirely from Ukrainian territory and cease all military operations. We also take note of the reported withdrawal of Russian forces from around the Chernobyl nuclear site. The International Atomic Energy Agency reports that this development will hopefully allow it to conduct an assistance and support mission to provide technical advice and to deliver equipment where necessary as soon as possible. All nuclear sites in Ukraine must be fully protected and secured. Military operations in or around these locations must be avoided. Madam President, the numbers tell a tragic, if yet incomplete, story. According to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, at least 1,480 civilians have been killed and at least 2,195 injured between 24 February and 4 April 2022. OHCHR believes that the actual figures are considerably higher. We are gravely concerned by the persistent use of explosive weapons with the wide impact area in or near populated areas. Such weapons are causing most civilian casualties, as well as massive destruction of civilian infrastructure, including residential buildings, hospitals, schools, water stations, and electricity systems. OHCHR has received credible allegations that Russian forces have used cluster munitions in populated areas at least 24 times. Allegations that Ukrainian forces have used such weapons are also being investigated. As noted by the High Commissioner, indiscriminate attacks are prohibited under international humanitarian law and may amount to war crimes. The massive destruction of civilian objects and the high number of civilian casualties strongly indicate that the fundamental principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution have not been sufficiently adhered to. In besieged cities, a significant increase in mortality rates among civilians can also be attributed to the disruption of medical care and basic services. People with disabilities and the elderly are particularly vulnerable. As of 4 April 2022, the World Health Organization has reported a total of 85 attacks on healthcare facilities, resulting in at least 72 fatalities and 43 injuries. Madam President, we are seriously concerned about reports of cases of arbitrary arrests and enforced disappearances of persons who have been vocal against the Russian invasion. As of 30 March, OHCHR has documented the arbitrary detention and possible enforced disappearance of 22 journalists and civil society members in Kyiv, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia regions. 24 local officials have also been detained in regions under Russian control, 13 of whom have been subsequently released. We call for the immediate release of all individuals who have been arbitrarily detained, including journalists, local officials, civil society activists, and others. Also, as of 30 March, OHCHR has recorded 7 journalists and media workers killed since hostilities began. Another 15 have come under armed attack, 9 of whom were injured. Allegations of conflict-related sexual violence perpetrated by Russian forces have also emerged. These include gang rape and rapes in front of children. There are also claims of sexual violence by Ukrainian forces and civil defense militias. The UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine continues to seek to verify all these allegations. We're also concerned about disturbing videos depicting abuse of prisoners of war on both sides. All prisoners of war must be treated with dignity and full respect for their rights in accordance with international humanitarian law. Madam President, the many credible allegations of serious violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law from areas recently retaken from Russian forces must not go unanswered. We support efforts to examine these allegations and to gather evidence. Ensuring accountability and justice for acts committed during the war will not be easy, but it is essential. Madam President, we are heartened by the generosity of neighboring countries who have accepted millions of refugees and the solidarity of the Ukrainian people who are hosting their displaced compatriots. With more than 10 million people displaced, either within Ukraine or abroad as refugees, roughly 1/4 of the population, the United Nations is gravely concerned about the heightened risk of human trafficking. Indeed, suspected and verified cases of human trafficking are surfacing in the surrounding countries, according to the International Organization for Migration. Madam President, this war is devastating Ukraine now, but it also threatens its future. Early assessment projections by UNDP suggest that if the war continues through 2022, Ukraine faces the prospect of seeing 18 years of socioeconomic progress lost. This would set the country and the region back decades and leave deep, long-term social and economic fissures. UN agencies, including UNDP, are working to help preserve Ukraine's hard-won development gains. This involves supporting the government to sustain essential government structures and basic services, including emergency measures to sustain livelihoods, such as cash-based assistance. Madam President, the war in Ukraine has damaged Europe's security architecture. Its economic repercussions are already evident far from the battlefield. The longer the war continues, the greater the risk that it will further weaken the global institutions and mechanisms dedicated to preserve peace and security. The war was started by choice. There is no inevitability to it or to the suffering it is causing. The United Nations is ready to do everything within its means to help bring an end to it. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Ms. DiCarlo for her briefing. And I now give the floor to Mr. Martin Griffiths.
Thank you, Madam President. As you've just heard from the Secretary-General and Under Secretary-General DiCarlo, Ukrainian civilians are paying far too high a price for this war. I want to speak briefly about humanitarian needs and what we're doing to meet them before I then refer to my recent travels. In the last 6 weeks, as we have heard, at least 1,430 people have been killed, among them over 121 children. And we know this is very likely a serious underestimate. Homes and civilian infrastructure, bridges, hospitals, schools have been damaged and destroyed. And in fact, the current figures on displacement tell us that more than 11.3 million people have now been forced to flee their homes. And of that, 4.2 million are now refugees in those generous neighboring countries that Rosemary has just been referring to. So in total, more than a quarter of the population of Ukraine has fled in this extraordinary short time. And unfortunately, we can imagine that these figures will continue to rise until we can find a pause and some peace. Madam President, the ground and air offensives and counteroffensives are making life nearly impossible for many civilians in Ukraine. Families, the elderly, women and children have been trapped by fighting already for too long. For more than 5 weeks, the people of Mariupol have been caught up in the fighting. And it is well documented that really Mariupol is a center of hell. Other cities like Chernihiv, Sumy, and Kharkiv remain cut off from essential goods and services. And perilous conditions are hampering our efforts to access civilians or for them to access us. And we restate here that civilians must be allowed to move to safer areas without the fear of attacks and at their own choice and at their own selection. It's vital that all parties to the conflict respect their obligations under international humanitarian law to protect civilians and to allow impartial humanitarian organizations safe, rapid, unimpeded access to all civilians in need wherever they are in Ukraine. Madam President, as the world watches humanitarian needs soar in Ukraine, the United Nations and our partner organizations are making every effort to dramatically increase our support to affected civilians. The work of the 6,000 volunteers from the Ukraine Red Cross, as we have noted before in this chamber, together with local NGOs in eastern Ukraine, these people, these organizations continue to work tirelessly at the front line of assistance to communities. The World Food Programme has reached more than 1.3 million people with cash and food assistance and plans to push that number up to 2.5 million people in this month. Health partners report that more than 180 tons of medical supplies were delivered in Ukraine, with another 470 tons on the way. And this will address the health needs of around 6 million people in the months ahead. And I'm pleased to say, that seems an odd word to say in the context of Ukraine, that after much effort in the past day, another convoy went from our humanitarian hub in Dnipro to the Far East. Today, food, winter clothing, non-food items, medicine, hygiene kits were offloaded to the Ukraine Red Cross and will reach the hands of those most in need. Indeed, following notification to both parties, a formal process that we and also the International Red Cross are engaged in, 4 convoys in total from the UN have provided critical support to people in some of the cities encircled by war and affected by ongoing fighting. Several more are planned. So these are initial steps, but it gives us a basis to now expand, taking our efforts up to scale and expanding much more than 1 convoy a day. As the Secretary-General and the Under-Secretary-General has already said, I want to also join them in expressing my concern over the growing number of reports we receive of human trafficking, sexual violence, exploitation, and abuse in Ukraine and in the region. And as ever, such horrific incidents as we're seeing, they overwhelmingly impact displaced women and children more than others. We're bolstering protection and gender-based violence services through agencies to provide specialized care for survivors and through the wealth of civil society organizations in Ukraine. These services are designed, carried out directly in collaboration with and through Ukrainian civil society, including, very particularly, women-led organizations. Madam President, today I'm addressing you from Geneva, having just returned from Moscow overnight. As you know, the Secretary-General, as he said, charged me to bring both sides together on humanitarian grounds to explore both specific and sustained ways to reduce humanitarian suffering, including in particular, inter alia, but in particular, the pursuit of a humanitarian ceasefire. Yesterday in Moscow, I had long and frank exchanges with the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sergei Lavrov, and his deputy, Sergei Vershinin, and then separately with Alexander Fomin, the Deputy Minister of Defense. In my meetings with these senior officials, I discussed also, in addition to these possibilities of humanitarian ceasefires, I discussed the issue of humanitarian convoys, of safe passage, including the 4 which I've already referred to. I outlined possibilities for building further on that cooperation, sharing specific suggestions for mutually agreed upon military freezes to allow for evacuation of civilians and for the safe passage of life-saving aid, in effect for humanitarian pauses in different parts of Ukraine to save lives and bring back a modicum of safety for those living in those places. My counterparts in Moscow received these suggestions, assured me of their intent to carefully study those ideas, which I left with them. And we agreed to remain in close contact. And I came away from these meetings believing that we have a very long road ahead of us, but it must be traveled. And Madam President, we will travel it. Tomorrow I plan to travel to Ukraine to have discussions with senior authorities from the Ukrainian government in Kyiv on Thursday on these same issues and others that they will no doubt present to me. And also to see firsthand with our crisis coordinator, Amin Awad, the humanitarian response. Madam President, thanks to generous donor contributions, many from governments in this chamber, the humanitarian response since February has indeed been scaled up, allowing us to meet the needs of 1.5 million people. We will need sustained financial support for needs in Ukraine. And like the Secretary-General, I want to stress, as he has done consistently, that funding must not be diverted from other crises. And Madam President, for Afghanistan, that is one example. And as you heard from David Beasley last week, conflict, climate shocks, COVID, compounded by the soaring food and fuel costs indicated by the Secretary-General, could push another 47 million people globally into severe food insecurity. And so the total number of people around the world who will not know where their next meal comes from could be driven to the astonishing figure of 325 million people around the world. That is by a long distance the highest in our recent history, and well over double what it was 3 years ago. So, Madam President, I close, of course, like others, by reminding the Council of what the Council already knows well. The world cannot afford this war, and neither can the people of Ukraine. And like others, I call on all Council members and member states with influence to support all efforts from whatever part they come from in the pursuit of peace and the alleviation of humanitarian suffering, for the sake of the people of Ukraine, for the sake of those around the world who cannot afford to bear the additional burden this war imposes on them and all of us. We must, as the Secretary-General said, silence the guns. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Mr. Griffiths